Well, I feel like I'm in some 1980s spin-off show from Starsky and Hutch. All right, so we don't have our usual introduction today. That's because we came in this morning with the idea of building the show from scratch, and we had so many twists and turns in terms of what we decided to do that by the time we got all those done, there was no time to write and record an intro. So sorry to the fans of the intro. You'll just have to wait until tomorrow. We'll have a great intro for you, or maybe not. All right, so let me tell you what's coming a little bit later in the show. Over the weekend, there was kind of a controversy, or the beginning of a controversy, about whether the football is used in one of the playoff games in the NFL. Maybe they were deflated. So we're going to talk about that. What nobody talked about was what would that mean? What difference would it make if footballs were deflated? So Anissa Ramirez, who's an actual scientist who studies football, is going to explain that and a few other things to us. And then towards the end, you may already be tired of hearing about the Larry Wilmore Show if you just listen to Fresh Air, but Eric Deggett is the TV critic for NPR, and I have a conversation about that, which I can tell you is very interesting because we've already done it. So here at the beginning, though, we're live, and we're talking about words, and that tends to get people to call in. So let me give you the phone number, 860-275-7266. 860-275-7266. In just a minute, you'll meet Jessica Bennett, a freelance journalist, columnist for Time Magazine, also contributes to the New York Times, where she was called to our attention because she covered the American Dialect Society convention, where they picked the WOTI, Word of the Year. So that almost could be I don't know if you say WOTI or not, but that could be a Word of the Year all by itself. In studio with us, our go-to guy about language, Peter Sokolowski, editor-at-large at Merriam-Webster, blogs at Merriam-Webster Unabridged, appears in Ask the Editor videos at Merriam-Webster.com. You're getting a theme here, and was named among Time's best Twitter feeds of 2014. There were 140 of those, appropriately. So Peter, before we get into how Merriam-Webster does this Word of the Year thing, let's talk a little bit, and Jessica, in just a second, will set the scene for us. But when you're looking at language and what could be a Word of the Year, well, we should say, Merriam-Webster, you guys just basically, you go by what people search your site for.
Yeah, we go by statistics. We kind of use the data-driven, and that has worked really well for us because so many people come to the website to look up words, and that has allowed us to know which words they are and which words are looked up on a perennial basis and which words are looked up on a spike basis, on an instantaneous basis of interest. And for example, tonight I'll be live tweeting the president's speech because every hour you see different words. You see the whole country like a tennis match looking in one direction and then in another in terms of vocabulary. And so we found that that's a story we can tell that others can't tell as well. And to be honest, the American Dialect Society is the granddaddy of the Words of the Year. It's the oldest one, going back over 20 years. And they have a group of linguists who are professionals and academics who look at words as a part of their livelihoods. And they decide, looking back over the last 12 months, which words really reflect the zeitgeist. And so it's kind of two different models.
It is two different models. We should say, by the way, that Ben Schmidt and somebody else, I think they recently did a graph of the words that are used in the State of the Union address over time.
Yes.
Freedom is very popular right now. I mean, they rarely use an interesting word, although in 2006, George Bush was very close to using the word chimera, which would have been a really interesting word.
Wow.
Because you're talking about human-animal hybrids.
Yes.
And, I mean, the next word could have been chimera, which is a word that people don't even know how to pronounce. So that would have been cool. But that would be in the category of things that didn't happen. All right, so as we're going along here, let's add into the conversation. As soon as I find her on the board, there she is. Jessica Bennett, as I said, freelance journalist, writes for the New York Times, covered in Portland, Oregon, said meeting of the American Dialect Society. Jessica, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So set the scene for us. What's it like there with all these language nerds?
Well, this is kind of a Super Bowl for language nerds, as I understand it. I'm from Seattle originally, so our Seahawks are going to the actual Super Bowl. But last weekend, I was in neighboring Portland, a rival in some ways, where a lot of lexicographers were gathered to debate and put forth new words. And this is fun for me as kind of a cultural observer because so many of these words are coming out of the internet. They're coming out of Twitter, or they're pop culture related. And one of them was even the lumbersexual, which pretty much defines the kind of rugged man that dominates all of Portland.
Indeed, and we are familiar with the lumbersexuals. We were talking about them on the show on Friday. Well, Peter, when you look at this, when you look at the sort of the zeitgeist-oriented word of the year as opposed to the really denotative statistic-based model that you use, there's sort of two ways to look at that, too. Sometimes it's almost like buying a stock. You pick a word that's just coming into its own. It's got a lot of room for growth. But you don't know whether that growth will happen or not. Or you can pick a word or phrase that's really peaking, that's really kind of on everybody's lips.
Yeah.
But there's risks to the first technique, right? If you decide that, well, I mean, for example, a few years ago, a lot of people, including Merriam-Webster, went to an online poll for a couple of years. Everybody decided truthiness was like this really great word. But, I don't think people not named Stephen Colbert don't really use truthiness in their toolkit that much.
Right. Well, and so what you're referring to is the fact that truthiness was the word of the year. We've evolved with the internet, and there was this what was then a new idea of social engagement, of user engagement, and in 2006 we did ask for users to vote. And what happened was, of course, this is a consequence of internet activity, which is that somebody put their thumb on the scale. Colbert campaigned for it, and his Colbert Nation, I should say, campaigned for it, and they got their vote out. The same thing happened recently for the Scrabble dictionary when Hasbro asked which word should be added to play in Scrabble, and the geocache movement put their thumb on the scale. They got organized. They were organized socially on Facebook and Twitter, and they put in the most votes, so they won. So in a sense, it does strike us as being more honest to kind of go to the more democratic, small d democratic idea of looking at usage. And so, for example, if there's a big story in a given year, for example, 2003, the word was democracy. Well, that was after the invasion of Iraq, so obviously the country was looking that word up. And then 2008, the word was bailout, and that makes sense with the Great Recession. So the fact is, sometimes the words that are most looked up online also reflect the zeitgeist.
So, Jessica, when you're on the floor there at the American Dialect Society convention, is it like being on the floor at a political convention? Are there operatives running around campaigning for and lobbying for certain words?
Kind of. A political convention in a very tiny room with linguists sitting on the floor because there wasn't enough space. But yes, lively discussion. People could nominate from the floor. At a certain point, there was kind of a generational divide with the younger linguists shouting the word basic, which they wanted to win and be nominated for a certain category, while some of the older linguists in a different area of the room were really vying for the word bud tender, which is a person who now with legalized marijuana actually stands behind the counter at legal dispensaries and serves up the pot.
So explain, what did Jessica win as the word of the year? This was a pretty controversial choice.
Right. So for the first time ever this year, there was a hashtag category. And my understanding is that was a bit controversial within the linguistic community because a hashtag is not necessarily a word or a single word. And so among the hashtag category, the winner was Black Lives Matter, which of course has become huge in the wake of various police killings. And Black Lives Matter actually won almost unanimously for the word of the year. So how it works is there are different categories, things like most creative, most likely to succeed, the new one, most popular hashtag. And then from those, or from nominations from the floor, the entire group, which was about 300 people, actually voted and chose the word of the year, which was Black Lives Matter.
So, Peter, this was controversial. It may have been unanimous there in Portland, or nearly unanimous there in Portland. But as lexicographers look at it, first of all, it seems as though you're redefining the word. And this could be kind of a change that reflects other kinds of changes. I mean, Time magazine used to have a Man of the Year, and then they would give the award to organizations and women, and they'd still call it the Man of the Year, and they ultimately had to sort of admit that it wasn't a man. But so those are the kinds of changes that we go through. You could say it's like that. We've said, well, maybe we need to sort of think differently about what a word is. Maybe hashtag plus 3 words is sort of a word.
Yeah.
But then there's the counter argument, which is no, it's just not a word.
I think it's an open question. I'm not an expert on this, but I mean, is it a lexical unit? In other words, is it a group of sounds that convey a single meaning? Maybe not. And the fact is, when you vote like this, you get a kind of activism, you get a kind of emotion, you get all kinds of things that go on, and people do feel a responsibility at the ADS meetings to very accurately reflect the past year's news and emotions and changes. And to me, it becomes a more social than linguistic phenomenon. But of course, even that's fascinating. And my good friends who run the ADS meetings, Ben Zimmer and Grant Barrett, they are very good linguists, and they know what they're talking about. And Jessica can fill us in on any other details, but clearly this was also kind of an emotional choice.
Obviously,
right.
Yeah, go ahead, Jessica. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that I took it was a lot of what this voting process is about is identifying cultural trends from the year, and some of that is newsy. Mm-hmm. And so, Black Lives Matter coming out of Twitter predominantly has really become this kind of grassroots rallying cry against racial injustice in this country, and I think that has been a huge theme of the year. So whether it is an actual word or considered a word, that's not my area of expertise, but as somebody who observes culture, I think this actually was a really interesting and reflective decision. Okay,
so the other question would be, is it the case that from now and forever, by which on the internet we mean the next 7 or 8 years, people will use that hashtag again and again to describe the same kinds of circumstances? And I think that's possible. But once again, Peter, it's a little bit like buying low or buying during a spike, maybe, and that's even more dangerous. You buy during a spike, and then it turns out that the spike goes down.
Yeah, Jessica, you may know of past ADS Words of the Year. I'm sure there are lots of them that smell a little old today. Is that correct?
The first one they were telling me was bush lips. This was in 1990, a word for insincere political rhetoric. Obviously came from George W. Bush saying, "Read my lips, no new taxes," which turned out to not be true. But, the word bush lips today, will anyone recognize that or not think that you're just talking dirty in some way? I'm not sure. So I think that the idea is these reflect a cultural moment, but I actually do think that Black Lives Matter will endure. And just as we've seen with some of these other hashtags, like Yes All Women, which was spawned in the wake of the shooting at UC Santa Barbara, these continue to infiltrate and to be used as kind of an identifier for a type of behavior or a social injustice.
The question, I guess, would be sort of back to that lexical unit question. Is it an organizing tool for certain kinds of comments, or is it a word all by itself? And maybe that is a sort of a time will tell type question. Peter, what did Merriam-Webster wind up with? Where did you guys come out with your annual bird count this year?
Our word of the year. So I have to explain just a little bit, because we have a lot of traffic at the website, and what's great about that is we now know which words people are looking up, and that's great. Moment to moment, you can sometimes see things that people are thinking about. But for the word of the year, we're talking about huge volume. So over 100 million page views a month on the website, and a similar number for the apps. So a huge volume of words. What we find is that the evergreen words, the perennial words, the words that are looked up day in and day out, regardless of the news, are the same. They're words that really populate the very top of our lookup list. They're words like irony or pragmatic or disposition. And so what we have to do is essentially eliminate those words that tell us nothing about the past year, but just tell us something about the English language. Words like affect and effect, for example, which are always looked up in very high numbers. And then what we do is we look up those words that have a huge number of lookups, but that changed over the last year, that had a huge growth year over year. And for this year, the word was culture, which is a very big surprise to people because it seems like such a basic word. But the fact is, grown-ups use the dictionary in ways that we look up words to fine-tune our knowledge, to confirm or assess something. So that's why we're looking up slightly abstract terms like irony or pragmatic or integrity. These are the words that people look up in the dictionary day in and day out, and they're sort of our bread and butter words. Culture has actually now moved into the 30th position as the most overall looked up word on our website in its history. So now it's disqualified essentially because it's become a perennial term. But I will say culture was a word that spiked on Labor Day every single year during the first weeks of September. It's the back to school lookup. It is the single most looked up word for back to school. Clearly an academic word, but also it has broadened and it's been used everywhere. It's a mystery to us. We can't tell you exactly one reason for this. It's simply that this is a word that's being researched more frequently this year than it had been in the past.
It's so interesting that so many of the words that compete in these categories, both old and new, are also words that we use for talking about the debate itself. So
yes, exactly.
One of the questions is, when does a word become part of the culture?
Right.
Well, culture is one of the words. And Jessica, Peter said, culture is a very basic word. So maybe you better explain to us why people on the floor of the American Dialect Society were campaigning for and shouting on behalf of the word basic. Probably not in its most commonly used sense.
Yes, a little bit different meaning. Basic, I think, refers to a person, though it's been broadened to mean thing, that is sort of the ultimate mainstream obvious choice. So you may have seen there were a few skits online that went viral. A woman wearing probably leggings and Ugg boots, those furry Australian boots, getting her sort of vanilla caramel latte at Starbucks. And probably listening to top 40 hits on her iPod. So just a kind of obvious basic choice, but not to be confused with the type of basic that Peter was referring to.
To me, one of the other interesting things to watch, Peter, is the journey that certain words and phrases make out of their technical specialties and into the common parlance. So for me, one of the phrases this year that did that was uncanny valley, which is a coinage that came up, I think, in 1970. Mm-hmm. But it's a word, it refers to our kind of revulsion against something that's looks almost human but isn't. Mm-hmm. So if you're freaked out by the animation on Polar Express because it's so close to being human, you're experiencing the uncanny valley. Another one is, I think, vocal fry, which was a term that only speech therapists knew for years and years and years. Now it gets talked about over the last 2 or 3 years. But you can't really give those. It's harder to give those even an ADS award because they've been around for so long.
Well, I think vocal fry was part of the ADS discussion, but one phrase that was part of our top 10 list was je ne sais quoi, and I love this story. It's simply because je ne sais quoi was used in a TV commercial for Sonic for Buffalo Wings, and because it was used in that TV commercial that was viewed by so many people, it was in our top 20 for months and months and months. And that's great for lots of reasons. One is that it reminds people that we put common foreign phrases in our dictionaries, and if people are curious about them, they can find out their English meanings in the dictionary. And it also shows the penetration of media, of advertising.
So, Jessica, did you have a word or phrase that you were secretly rooting for? I know you have to be an impartial journalist, but you're human, too.
Yeah, I don't know how impartial I was. I did raise my hand at one point with my editor's permission. But there were a couple that I really loved. Manspreading is one that, as a New York City resident who rides the subway every day and is frequently trying to squeeze into a tiny space while a man is sitting next to me with his legs spread so wide that you could probably fit 3 backpacks between them. I had an affinity for that one. And another one that I like, narcissistic, which is a pejorative term for those selfie sticks that you see everyone carrying around now. It's those long sticks that you can put your phone on the end of so that you can take like an actual nice-looking selfie as opposed to having your hand half in it. But narcissistic, play on narcissistic and selfie stick, I also love.
Also, well, I know somewhere on your list was Columbusing, a word we discussed at length on our show one day. That, of course, refers to claiming you discovered something that actually existed for a long time. But because you know about this very cool Thai restaurant in Bushwick, you've Columbused it, right?
Columbusing. I haven't heard it in that context, but yes, I like that. And as one of the linguists at the convention was pointing out, it's actually a really interesting combination of 2 words, busing and Columbus.
By the way, our number is 860-275-7266 if you want to chime in about this, 860-275-7266. Peter, in one of your reviews in the New York Times Book Review, once again, writing about language often churns up some of these new words. Mm-hmm. And there was one that I really liked a lot, reversification. Explain what reversification is.
Yeah, reversification, the writer John Lanchester, who you might think of as a journalist about finance, but you might think of as a novelist, a wonderful novelist. And he's also written a great memoir. He's one of my favorite writers, and he's a British writer. He writes for the New Yorker magazine as well. But he wrote a great book called How to Speak Money, and he coined this term reversification, which means that a lot of the technical terms, the terms that finance people use, are almost almost deliberately obscure, and they make what they're talking about difficult for the layman. And so, for example, the word credit, which actually means debt, it goes backwards in that sense. And so he has a wonderful book that I reviewed in the Times last month on this kind of vocabulary of finance, and he goes through each and every term with a nice little short, sort of sharp essay. He's a very witty writer, but he's also deadly serious about this. The real meat of that book is about inequality ultimately, and he wants to make sure that people know what people are talking about when they're talking about finance.
My favorite is that bailout, which
Yes.
should mean sort of scooping water up with a bucket and dumping it out of a sinking ship, refers to pouring money into
Exactly.
the sinking ship.
It's a perfect example. Yeah.
And just very quickly, sort of another term that I think sort of comes up in that lexicographic area that I love, and I think I actually did enjoy kind of a good year this year, is prochronism, which is, a cousin to anachronism. It's when you're watching Downton Abbey and they use a phrase like learning curve.
Yes.
And you're sitting there going, no, they didn't say that.
It's a parlor game to watch Mad Men or Downton Abbey or any of these period shows to hear the language, and it is a little bit dismaying. I would love to see real accurate speech depiction in such a thing, and I wonder if we would. I wonder if we'd understand it as well. I'm not sure.
We might not understand it as well, but we also might be wrong. Sometimes we actually think, oh no, that didn't exist
Right.
until 10 or 15 years ago, and then it turns out it's been around forever. Sure. So Jessica, in general, if you were to describe the kinds, I use the term language nerds in a very default way at the beginning, but if you were, without using the word basic at all, to describe who's at the American Dialect Society, who's at the American Dialect Society convention?
They're not basic. They're far from basic. I use the word language nerds as well, but it turns out I think I am a bit of a language nerd because I felt like I fit right in. And, this both took place on a Friday night, and I was thinking to myself, this is really my ideal thing to be doing on a Friday night, is voting for Words of the Year. So it was a really fun group. They were an active group and a vocal group. And I think that, as some were describing, they spend a lot of time in the weeds of academic research and probably don't get to actually stand up and debate and have a little fun with words all that often, even though they're dealing with them every day. And I'm sure, Peter, you can speak to this. But it was fun to sort of see all these linguists in their prime shouting out of turn and making some jokes along the way.
Well, Peter, I don't know whether you would confirm that. I know the linguist Ann Curzon says when she runs into somebody at a party, people either run away from her the minute they find out what she does, or she can't get rid of them because all they want to do is have this declinist spout about what's gone wrong with the language.
Absolutely. And I know Ann, and she was there, and Michael Adams, another great linguist and professor, was there. These are the superstars of the field, and they're very serious people who write very serious books. But you know what? They have a great sense of humor, and they take the business of words very seriously. So, Jessica, you're obviously a word nerd. There's no doubt about it. But to have them all in one place, because they're there for the Linguistic Society conference, so they're all there for a conference, and this is kind of a fun adjunct to the conference.
All right. So as Jeff Foxworthy would say, if your idea of a really great Friday night is yelling words and neologisms and debating them from the floor of the American Dialect Society, you might be a language nerd. Mm-hmm. Thanks very much to Peter Sokolowski. We wouldn't dream of doing this without him. He's editor-in-large at Merriam-Webster. Great to meet you, Jessica Bennett, freelance journalist, columnist for Time, and also contributes to the New York Times, where we found her. Coming up, a conversation. I'm trying to think if there's a neologism here anywhere. I don't think so, but, Deflatorgate or Deflategate, I guess, is the one that people are shopping around. Was air let out of the football in the New England Patriots game? We'll also be talking to Eric Deggans about Larry Wilmore, now hosting a brand new show on Comedy Central.
A pair of mouse is mice, a pair of moose is meese. A paranoia is a bunch of mental blocks.
Over the weekend, you may have been watching some football. I certainly was. And then after the weekend, you may have heard of a controversy. I don't even know if it rises to the level of a controversy because we're still kind of debating whether it's real or not. But there are allegations anyway that the New England Patriots had deflated some of the footballs that were used in their game against the Indianapolis Colts. First of all, when I heard about that, I knew there could only be one person who would be responsible for such a heinous act.
All out of roofs, eh?
Yeah.
Guess so.
Deflator Mouse. I should have known you'd be out tonight.
Well, if it isn't American-made, the world's most patriotic domestic. This looks like a job for Deflator Mouse.
All right, so it had to be Deflator Mouse. Only he could have done something like that. But we also wanted to know, the one thing that I haven't seen in any of the reporting about this, there's been a lot of reporting, although not a lot of substance here, but imagine that it were true. What difference would it make? In other words, what advantage would exist in either deflating or not deflating the ball? And we have a great go-to person on that. She's been on our show before, Anissa Ramirez. She's the co-author with Alan St. John of Newton's Football, The Science Behind America's Game. She's a scientist. She looks at these things. So first of all, welcome back to our show.
Great to be here.
And let's talk about the ball itself before we even get to whether it needs to be inflated, deflated. The ball itself is kind of interesting. There aren't a lot of other balls in sports that are shaped like this.
Yeah, the ball's got a great history. We call it the pigskin, but if you look at your football, it actually says cowhide. Why is that? Well, it ends up that when the ball was originally made, when the game was originally made, it was actually made from a pig's bladder. And the pig's bladder is quite small, but it can inflate up into a shape that kind of looks like what the football has evolved into becoming. So that's the reason why we call it the pigskin. And a mathematician would give that crazy shape of the long cone that it has. They would call it a prolate spheroid, which is just a fancy way to say that it's longer in one direction than it is in the other.
And if we had been playing football in the era of Teddy Roosevelt, it would have been less prolate, right? I mean, hasn't it become more prolate over time to make it a little bit more aerodynamic and easier for the quarterback to hold?
That's absolutely right. It was a little bit more rounded on the end, and that's because the game at the time was more about carrying the ball and pushing through to other players. But when the forward pass was installed, the ball became more prolate, it became more pointy, and became more aerodynamic, just like you said.
So let's talk about this deflation thing. So to whose advantage would it be to either deflate or not deflate the ball?
Well, deflating the ball helps a lot of players. It's easier to hold. So if you're throwing the ball and the person's catching the ball, especially on the rainy day that happened during the game, it's easier to catch because it's more squishy. And on a rainy day, it's probably slippery, so it's easier to hold it. And also deflating the ball is great for kickers because then they're able to transfer their momentum from their leg to the ball because it's able to be more receptive, more compliant. So making the ball slightly squishier or deflating it actually is an advantage both for receivers and for kickers.
Let's talk about the kickers for a second. So in other words, the way I understand it, the longer their foot is in contact with the ball, the more alleged control, anyway, they would have over the ball. And obviously the squishier the ball is, the longer, when we were talking milliseconds here, but the longer the foot is with the ball, right?
That's exactly right. What the kicker's trying to do is they actually want to have more area between their foot and the ball. So think of a beach ball. If a beach ball is overinflated and the beach ball is kind of underinflated, when you kick an underinflated beach ball, your foot's going to connect with it, and the beach ball is going to wrap around the foot better than when it's overinflated. And so that's what the kicker wants. It wants to have more contact, its foot to have more contact with the ball so that all the momentum that the kicker's generated when it started running and started whipping its hip, all that goes to the ball so that the ball will go out further. So kickers really would love to have the ball to be slightly softer than it is.
And this is one of the reasons why on cold days people talk about the kicking game maybe being a little less reliable, right? Because a cold ball is going to be a hard ball.
Yeah, that's true, too. When the ball gets cold, something actually happens to the skin of the ball. What happens is it becomes less springy. Scientists would call that the coefficient of restitution. So cold weather actually changes the skin of the ball so that it would not be compliant, so the kicker has a shorter or smaller area of contact, and so the ball wouldn't go out as far.
So every kicker, obviously, this is a very tough game for a kicker. A lot of it's mental, a lot of it is sort of staying focused. A lot of it is believing, probably, that you can do it. I mean, kickers get the yips. Sometimes they lose confidence in themselves. One way to give yourself more confidence would be to feel as though you had some kind of an advantage. I know from you that kickers have historically been known to try to do things to the ball to make it more kickable.
Oh, yeah. Well, kickers have a really tough job. They've got millions of people staring at them. When you make a mistake, if I make a mistake, nobody cares. But if you have millions of people looking at you while you make a mistake, it's really a really mental game. So they do all kinds of things to make sure that they can have a slight advantage in terms of improving the amount of contact area that they have with the ball. And so when Alan and I were writing Newton's Football, we found a huge list of what people have done. They've microwaved, hammered, Gatorade, steam bathed, milked, inflated, deflated the ball. They've done a whole bunch of things to soften the skin of the ball so that they can have a little bit more area where their foot can hit it so that it will go out further.
One thing that you point out in the book about the football itself and the fact that it isn't round is that there's an implicit level of chaos introduced to the game simply by the shape of the ball, although coaches, teams have the choice of either maximizing or minimizing it. I mean, if somebody drops it, if there's a fumble, if there's a ball jarred loose, it's so much less predictable than a basketball or a football. And what happened in one of the games this weekend is that they intentionally made an onside kick where the ball bounced crazily, placing a lot of pressure on the other team to be able to catch it. So this is coaches with a very sort of Apollonian logical mind trying to deal with a facet of the game that's inherently unpredictable.
Absolutely. I mean, coaches are always trying to find an advantage, and because the ball has such a strange shape, it's not a sphere like a basketball or tennis ball. If a tennis ball or a basketball were to bounce, you know where they're going to go. But a football, you have no idea. And a scientist would call that randomness. And coaches that can use randomness to their advantage actually have a better chance of doing well. When Alan and I were writing Newton's Football, we analyzed two teams that were kind of performing the same, and we looked to see how well they recovered the fumbles. And one team did a better job of recovering fumbles, and that team did better. So it's one of the few knobs that coaches still have, because there's so much parity between players and how they're performing, that controlling chaos or this randomness is one of the knobs that's still available in order to gain an advantage.
Now, one of the things that happens in football is that science, like the kind that you practice, Anissa Ramirez, co-author of Newton's Football, and the conventions of the game sometimes ram up against one another. And so, and there are all kinds of examples of really daring and innovative coaches. Most of them exist maybe down at the high school level. The most famous one is a guy named Kevin Kelly at Pulaski Academy in Little Rock, Arkansas. He never punts. He almost always attempts onside kicks to try to use that chaos to his advantage and get the ball back. And his playbook has got lots of gimmicks in it. And in general, he's trying to outthink the other team and doing a lot of stuff that's risky, but he claims if you look at the numbers, it's really not that risky. The rewards are big if, in fact, you can exploit some of that chaos to your advantage. This is something that you've written about, too, that coaches, meanwhile, there are all kinds of sort of rules that come from somewhere. They're received wisdom. You do that. You don't do that. If it's 4th and 4, you punt the ball. There's just things that coaches feel as though they would be punished if they didn't do, particularly if it didn't work. So can you talk about what science tells us about all that?
Well, you need to do a lot of different things in order to innovate and to create an advantage. And so I support coaches that do that, because that's how the game evolves as well. Now, we can't blame coaches for being averse to risk. So Alan St. John and I, we were studying why don't coaches go 4th and 4th. And then we talked to some scientists, and we saw that they actually studied monkeys to look at risk. And what they did is they taught the monkeys how to use money. They had two people, a person who was a stingy person and a person who was a generous person. The stingy person would show the monkey 3 grapes, and then the monkey would give them money, and then they would give the grapes to the monkey, but they would only give them 2 grapes. In another case, the person who was generous would show a monkey 1 grape, the monkey would give them money, and in that case, the monkey would receive 2 grapes. Now, in both cases, the monkey got 2 grapes, but the monkey did not like interacting with the person who they interpreted as being stingy. In fact, they hated that person 2.5 times more. So what we learned from this is that we actually have a sensitivity to risk. We don't like risk. We have a sensitivity to risk on the order of about 2.5 times more than when something's pleasant. So when coaches don't go for it, it's because of their genes. They don't like risk. They don't like to hear from fans in the back office about doing poorly, and so they'll be conservative in their approach because of this tendency.
That does explain a lot. It explains a lot of the things that, not that I'm bitter, my beloved Green Bay Packers failed to do on Sunday. Not that I'm bitter, not that I'm crying. Anissa Ramirez, it's great to talk to you, and now we know the Super Bowl is going to be in a warm place. We know what that does to the ball. So Anissa Ramirez, a scientist and author of Newton's Football, the science behind America's game. Thanks for being with us again today.
Thank you.
Just a little more, a little more. Okay, that's good. I was just letting some air out of Bill Maher's ego. Today's show was produced by Tucker Ives, Betsy Kaplan, and me, Kyone Wolf. Greg Hill tweets for us at WNPR Colin. Our intern is Adam Blutt. The part of Bill Curry was played by Marshawn Lynch. For show pages, articles, and videos of the Faith Middleton Show staff practicing an onside kick with an actual pig bladder, visit our website, WNPR.org. On tomorrow's show, can a song change the world? And now, back to Colin.
One of the other big developments over the weekend was the arrival of a new face on the late-night comedy television scene. He's Larry Wilmore. He's not that new a face if you're a fan of The Daily Show. He's been there for a long time, often appearing as their, quote, senior black correspondent, unquote. But there's a new space vacated by Stephen Colbert. That's at 11:30. Larry Wilmore is taking it over with something called The Nightly Show. Let's hear how things began last night.
Tonight, Lee, the Oscar nominations are out, and they're so white, a grand jury has decided not to indict them. Oprah marched on Selma this weekend. She has a dream that Selma shall overcome the wedding ringer at the box office. Yeah, we talk Selma, Ferguson, and Eric Garner. It's Comedy Central's worst nightmare. Brother finally gets a show on late night TV. He's got to work on Martin Luther King Day. Let's do this.
With us is Eric Deggans, NPR's TV critic. He's been with us lots of other times before, including even in our studio. Eric, first shows are really hard to do, and usually the performer puts a lot of pressure on him or herself, and, there's just sort of that feeling that too much is on the line. You really need to look at a show, 25, 50 episodes down the line to see how they're doing. But with all that said, how did Larry Wilmore do last night?
Yeah, with all that water under the bridge. Well, I did a story sort of previewing Larry's show for Morning Edition yesterday, and one of the things I said was that there's basically two components to your modern-day talk show. There's the format or the structure of it, and then there's how the host inhabits that format and sort of bends it to serve their comic sensibility, their talents, what they're good at. And so what we saw, I think, on Monday night was a very sort of solid structure. Larry is a longtime TV producer. He worked on the ABC show Blackish, for example, and he's worked on In Living Color and the Bernie Mac show and all that. So he knows how to structure a show. It's a format that's sort of similar to Bill Maher's Real Time on HBO, if you know that show. He starts off cracking some jokes, sort of like playing the senior black correspondent role that he played on The Daily Show. And then they shift into this freewheeling panel discussion, which is something that you haven't seen on a Daily Show or Colbert, and distinguishes this show a little bit. And I feel like it was a great structure. It was a respectable start. There were some really funny moments, and that's kind of what you want. And then over the days and weeks and months, he will figure out how to inhabit that space in a way that's much more unique to him. And we'll see it grow, and we'll see it change, and that's what I'm really looking forward to seeing as the show progresses.
One of the things that I've always liked about Larry Wilmore in his Daily Show appearances is he has kind of a low-key deadpan style. His energy is sort of different from a host's energy, and he'll stand there or sit there talking to Jon Stewart and in a very deadpan way, try to explain why, in fact, February is too long to be Black History Month, kind of counterintuitively, and be very funny about it. But when you're the host of the show, you can't really take your energy and your emotive level down that far. So I was intrigued last night to see that he kind of did hit, I think, a pretty sweet spot there. He was still his deadpan self, but obviously if you're the host, you got to be the host.
Right, exactly. Well, one of the things that was interesting to me, and of course we're picking this apart with a fine-tooth comb, but there were two segments featuring the panel, and the first segment was sort of he was kind of feeling his way through it. It wasn't quite as interesting, and I was sort of thinking to myself, I wonder if they're in trouble here. And then the second part of the panel was when everybody was a little more relaxed, and they really kind of said some funny stuff, and you got to see everybody's personality kind of come out. And Cory Booker got to say that he's not interested in being president, which absolutely nobody believes. So it was a nice little summation of the potential of what that panel could be. And I'm excited to see where they take it as the days go by.
Yeah, currently the format of this second segment is this thing called 100%, keeping it 100% real. And so what he does is he gives each panelist one question, and he gives the panelists as little wiggle room as possible in answering this question. Then if the panelist satisfies him and potentially maybe the audience as well, they get a nice sticker that says 100%. If they don't, they get tea bags, so signifying their answer was weak tea. And Cory Booker at the end kind of him musically. I got like a lot of tea bags thrown at him. The more he tried to equivocate, the more. Initially, as I was listening to this, I was thinking, well, this doesn't really seem fair. It seems as though it's a way of sort of depriving the guests of any kind of nuance and rewarding only the most blunt and facile answer. But you know what? The more I thought about it, the more I thought. I mean, his first question did go to Talib Kweli, and it was sort of about whether hip hop was part of the solution or part of the problem. This is an enormously sensitive question in the hip hop community, and actually we have one of his proteges, a guy named Self Suffice, who's going to be at our show on Wednesday. We've already taped that show. It kind of came up there, and I could tell it's a difficult question for somebody to answer, and you couldn't blame Kweli for kind of, really not wanting to say yes or no, but wanting to sort of put a framework around it. But it did result in some interesting content just because he kind of wasn't allowed to do that.
Well, what I thought was interesting about that question, and weird about it too, is that it's not an either-or question to me. I think it's both. And so that question was a weird one to start the segment on, that particular segment, because I think it really is both. There are things about hip-hop and rap that have been they've been empowering for people of color, especially black folks from the underclass. It has brought us a ton of amazing artists and a bunch of great music, but it has also helped foster this image of young black men as menacing and violent and threatening, and has encouraged some people to act that way, and has enriched some very dangerous people. So there's two sides to that coin, and often there are two sides to a coin in life, and we want to make things binary. We want to make things simple and black and white, and sometimes they're not. But all that said, when I saw the segment, I thought to myself, this is something that Meet the Press should have done like 15 years ago, because when you have these guys on and they want to equivocate, you get in their face and you say no. I want a direct answer to a direct question, and that's essentially what he was saying. And I thought it was great. And Cory Booker, by the way, did not equivocate. Right. He asked him if he wanted to be president, and he said no. Just nobody believed him. Right. So that's different than equivocating or trying to contextualize things in the way that Talib Kweli did.
It's interesting because when he went into this, so the way the show works is Larry Wilmore at the beginning has kind of a sort of monologue, throw to clips kind of segment. It's not unlike the opening to The Daily Show. But then he goes into this two-segment thing with this panel, and that, of course, looks a little bit more like Bill Maher, the late-night comedy host I really dislike the most. And so as that came up there, I had this sort of Pavlovian reaction, like, oh, no, not this. But, I mean, Wilmore, one of the real issues, Eric, is that, people make a decision to watch a late-night show. As you said, there's sort of two things, structure and then the host and how the host kind of fits in. You watch people you like, and there's no reason when you're getting ready to go to bed to watch somebody you don't like. And I think one thing that I noticed about Wilmore was I just liked him. There was something inherently, for all of his sort of deadpan, fake sourness, there's something a little bit likable about him.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And it is nice to see someone with a different energy inhabit that host role in late night. And it'll be interesting to see how he plays with that, and how he and particularly I want to see who he surrounds himself with. We really only saw one contributor from the show, a woman on the panel whose name I don't recall.
Her last name is Treasury, I think.
And she didn't say much. When this show was announced last year, part of the reason it was set up the way it was, we were told, is because Jon Stewart was interested in providing a forum for all these people who wanted to be correspondents on The Daily Show and who were funny, but for whom there really wasn't room for them. And so now here's a show with this panel where you can work in young, up-and-coming comics, particularly comics of color who may not have opportunities in other places, and give them a way to be correspondents or give them a way to be on the panel and have a voice. So it will be interesting to see. Certainly I understand in the very first show you're not going to have a bunch of people that nobody knows. But hopefully as the show goes on, we will see more of these young emerging voices, and it'll be a way to show the wide spectrum of talent that's out there, because I think if you just look at the cast of Saturday Night Live and the people we see on The Tonight Show and Kimmel and these typical shows, you don't really get a sense of the wide spectrum of comedic talent that's out there. A lot of people who don't get a shot at the SNLs, they don't get a shot at hosting a show or being part of the Daily Show correspondent mix. What's interesting is the Daily Show, too, has sort of quietly been an advocate for diversity among its on-air ranks. And even when they've lost people, even when people like Wyatt Cenac and now Larry Wilmore have gone on to other jobs, they haven't just replaced them with another white face. They have made sure that they have a wide mix of correspondents joking around with Jon Stewart, and that tradition seems to be continuing on The Nightly Show.
Although, interestingly, one of the themes of last night's episode was protest and activism. And The Daily Show, they got called on this a few years ago. I mean, one of the reasons they have the mix they do now was that people, critics and just regular people kind of made fun of how white they were. But
that was a long time ago.
Yeah.
I mean, you'd have to go. I mean, at one point, Wyatt Cenac and Larry Wilmore were among the regular contributors. Michael Che was on the show. Jessica Williams is on the show now. They've had Asif Manvi for quite a long while. Back when you could say The Daily Show was white, that was back when Colbert and Steve Carell and Ed Helms were regular correspondents. That was probably like 10 years ago or something. I mean, that was a long time ago. So
it all flew by.
You do have to wonder about their gender mix. It's still very male-heavy, and I think that's something that they definitely need to work on. But in terms of ethnicity, they've had a diverse cast of correspondents for a while.
One of the themes, as I said last night, was the efficacy of protest. How much protest is there? Does it work? And Larry Wilmore was calling attention to just the sheer amount of protest that goes on around the country, including one in which he kind of name-checked the state in which I'm sitting right now.
Yesterday in Oakland, people were protesting police violence, and even as I speak tonight, there's a demonstration going on in Grand Central Station because, there's no better way to win the hearts and minds of white people than making them miss their train to Connecticut.
So that got a laugh out of me, and it's sort of last question for you you, Eric Deggans, who's NPR's TV critic. So this is one of the challenges: is this a show? How big an audience can this show have? Can Larry Wilmore get white people to laugh at themselves and make us feel included in the joke? I felt pretty included in that joke.
Well, what scares me is that if this show doesn't perform for whatever reason, people will assume that it's because the jokes were about race. And I'm not sure that would necessarily be the conclusion. What has often irritated me about television is that when it tries, for example, there was a show called Undercovers that was on NBC a long time ago, and it starred a black couple, it's the first time I can remember. I don't think there's ever been an hour-long drama on network TV starring a black couple. And the show itself was very uneven. The leads were great, but the stories were confusing and jumbled, and it just never gelled as a series, and so it got canceled before too long. And there were people who were saying, maybe the fact that it had black leads was its problem, but that wasn't its problem. It just wasn't a good show. And now we see in the success of shows like Scandal and How to Get Away with Murder and Empire and Jane the Virgin and Blackish, 4 of the most successful shows that we've seen in the fall have had minority leads. And now we know the shows just have to be good, right? They just have to be good. And so I would say I don't expect Larry Wilmore's show to fail, to be honest, because it seems to have had a strong start. Larry's a talented guy, and he has a solid fan base amongst the Daily Show viewership that will feed right into the show. There may be a period where he gets lower ratings than Colbert, but I bet that picks up as they figure out ways to make the show really distinctive. But if it does fail, I would just hope that people wouldn't rush to conclude that it's because he joked about race, because there could be many other reasons why people don't take to the show, and it might have nothing to do with that. And something like that is really hard to prove. And what it becomes is an excuse for people to not try that kind of humor in a show again, or it becomes an excuse to not let that a non-white host host a show, which is also kind of stupid. So just as we found in network television that it's about the quality of the show, not the race of the lead, I think we're going to find here that it's about the quality of the show and not the subject matter necessarily.
Eric Deggans, TV critic for NPR, thank you so much for your time today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I used to think that I should watch TV. I used to think that it was good for me. Wanted to know what folks were thinking, to understand the land I live let me